Hello, and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton, with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of February 27th, 2025. We are coming to you this week from the Deep Past department here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House, overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest this week is author and historian Stefanos Geroulanos, who joins me to talk about his new book on the invention of prehistory. Stefanos Geroulanos is the director of the Remark Institute and a professor of history at New York University, where he's taught since 2008. He grew up in Greece and received his BA from Princeton University and a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He is the author or co-author of 5 books, including The Human Body in the Age of Catastrophe, Brittleness, Integration, Science, and the Great War, co-authored with Todd Myers, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2018. Transparency in Post-War France, A Critical History of the Present, published by Stanford University Press in 2017. And An Atheism That Is Not Humanist Emerges in French Thought, published by Stanford University Press in 2010. He is the editor of Volume 6 of the Bloomsbury Publishing series entitled A Cultural History of Ideas. Volume 6 is entitled A Cultural History of Ideas in the Modern Age. Since 2017, he has served as one of the executive editors of the Journal of the History of Ideas. His latest book, and the one he is here to talk about with me today, is entitled The Invention of Prehistory: Empire, Violence, and Our Obsession with Human Origins, published by Liveright in April 2024. It was reviewed widely in a number of national publications, including the New York Times on April 10th, the Wall Street Journal on April 12th, the New Yorker on May 6th, the New Republic on May 10th, the Atlantic magazine in the May 2024 issue, Foreign Affairs in their September-October issue, and the Washington Post on November 1st. The Post called it, quote, a thorough and sensitive work of reckoning, unquote. It's a book that grapples with big ideas about what it is that makes us human and why we're obsessed with where we came from. My conversation with Stefanos Geroulanos begins now. Stefanos Geroulanos, welcome to our podcast.
Stan, thank you so very much for having me here.
You've written a fascinating book called The Invention of Prehistory: Empire, Violence, and Our Obsession with Human Origins. And I read about this book for the first time, as I read about many books. It was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal, and it works on so many different levels. You are grappling with some very big issues about what it means to be human, what we think it means to be human. I want to start out with just the whole idea of prehistory. For those listening to this podcast who don't live in the world and swim in these waters as you and I do every day, what does prehistory even mean?
So that's a fantastic question, and that was a question that I had a great lot of trouble figuring out as I was going through. Usually we'll refer as prehistory to the period before written records, or to a period before, very stable, buildings that are now ruins, of course, but that have survived to us, indicating a stable society. So so prehistory can come to mean a whole number of different places and a whole number of different periods leading up to roughly, 6,000 BCE. Sometimes more recently, really the invention of writing. Sometimes a little bit earlier, if you can say that, people did used to trade jewelry, for example, and so we have archaeological findings that indicate complex societies living and sort of designing things of their own and living accordingly with clothing and necklaces and so on. So people will try to figure out what prehistory is, starting with the idea that after a point, things are a lot clearer because we have much clearer evidence of how human beings lived. And that we'll end up calling history. Anything before that will usually be called pre.
So just for the benefit of our listeners, let's determine, let's set out what we mean. So written history really begins where? With the Egyptians, Mesopotamians, and how many thousands of years does that go back?
Right. So we'll usually refer to the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, and then ancient China. Also the people living around the Indus River, so in India. in roughly 4 to 3,000 BC.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the idea that from there on we have um, a lot clearer senses and a lot more materials that tell us about how people lived, what they believed in, what they did on an everyday basis, how they managed agriculture, and so on. But note also that what's interesting about this is that it's a very variable date. So people in Europe didn't have didn't, let's say, enter history in the same way until much later. In Northern Europe, uh, we have relatively little evidence of how people lived before a certain time, other than certain kinds of pottery. For North and South America, we develop hypotheses, really the crossing of the Bering Strait, in order to understand how people first moved into the Americas, and then later how they stabilized into particular societies and nations. So, but they're very variable dates, with the key bits being the invention of agriculture, so 8 to 5,000 BC, the management of water, the building of relatively stable religious sites, and that's really in the Neolithic period. And then after that, the invention of writing, which just changes everything in terms of what kinds of records we get to.
Mm-hmm.
That's the beginnings of history. Yeah.
And to be clear, we know that we have found human remains of one form or another going back hundreds of thousands of years. So we're talking about a vast, deep space of time at which we really only know what we've dug up out of the ground.
That's right. And that's a very interesting problem. So we have Homo sapiens, depending on how exactly you define the species, uh, anywhere between 80 to 100,000 years ago, and in some cases as much as 250,000 years ago. A lot of this has to do with the naming, with particular details about the skeletons and so on. We have hominids that go back well over 1 million years at this and then we have hominins, which are basically, uh, species of the genus Homo that nevertheless are very different from even, like pre-Homo habilis, let's say, where we know that they use tools. We know that they didn't control fire. We don't know very much more about their societies. We generally have to depend on how they were. We
Mm-hmm.
don't know when language began and in what way we can think about the beginnings of language. We do know that people used vocal cords, that hominids used vocal cords. We do know that there are species that lived on this planet a lot longer than we have. Neanderthals survived some 400,000 years, only died out maybe 40 to 50,000 years ago. So these were complex societies that knew when they were going to go hunting, knew what they were hunting for, had to figure out how they would preserve themselves, particularly if they were in colder climates. They were peoples of great complexity. In many ways, we've reduced them into, our predecessors on this planet.
Mm-hmm. So, and also to be clear, so you mentioned the farthest back that we think we found human remains is 1 million years. Dinosaurs went extinct, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of 66 million years ago. It's almost impossible to wrap your mind around that kind of time, but there's this huge gap in between. People are sort of familiar with dinosaurs and the idea that they and humans did not coexist, but there were millions of years in between. So we know that there were people of one stamp or another who were here before the invention or what we call history. So we know there is such a thing as prehistory. How then was it invented? And what do you mean by that? What is the invention of prehistory?
Right. So over the past 3 centuries, scholars have tried to study what happened before written history. And this has included everyone from historians to biologists. They have sought to understand what early human beings were like, what their societies were like, how they related to who we are. Uh, and what I mean by the invention of prehistory is that what this ancient period was like is something that we have invented and reinvented, something that says more about us than it says about the people that lived on the planet, before written records. Um, but there is a very real way in which prehistory was let's say, invented as an earlier period. First, already from the late Renaissance period, the question was present: what happened before the Greeks? In what way do religious sources, in what way does the Bible hint at certain, let's say, ancient peoples, but not actually say very much about them? And what happened in that world from Mesopotamia and Egypt up to Greece? In the 16th and 17th century, uh, people are very confused by the existence of certain fossils, for example, shark teeth, on top of mountains. They are increasingly unsure of what it means to study the Earth and to study geologically twisted formations of geological strata. How do you get to understanding what this is? And by the 1750s, there's a clear sense that all these species of animals, in particular, their similarities and their differences point to, let's say, they point either to creation or to some sort of transformation on the planet, which raises grave theological questions and raises grave questions about what exactly the planet was and how it developed. So by the 1750s, you already have mutterings that the world isn't 5,000 years old, that however God created it, he wasn't dependent on, the movement of the sun, the movement of the earth around the sun. But that you don't actually know what happens for the long, dark periods of the Earth's making. That creation would have taken, in human terms, a lot longer than simply the years counted, and that early human history was really a complicated period about which we know relatively little. People start suggesting that the Earth may be something like several 100,000 years old, already in the 1750s, 1760s. But they know that that's a theological, that's going to pose a lot of, that's going to pose a lot of problems, particularly with the Catholic Church, and nobody wants to be in trouble over that. They want to be able to do their studies and get to something more concrete. So they sort of whisper it. They know that the idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old just doesn't work for them. And they know that they need something more detailed. In the early 19th century, geologists, particularly Charles Lyell, begin to describe the Earth as having an almost infinite age. And they ground this on geology, not on biological findings. It's not a matter that relates to Darwin almost at all. And then gradually, as they find models for explaining the Earth's transformation, suddenly, the dark abyss of time, as scholars have sometimes call it, begins to change. The realization that, let's say, behind us lie millions of years of this planet doing something and of species growing on it. So it's really at that moment when geology and then biology indicate that the age of the Earth and the age of humanity are much older. It's really at that moment that prehistory becomes a real question. Suddenly, it's not just, oh, let's imagine what early humans were like, but, oh, could we find some more bones, and what would these bones tell us? And what do they tell us about early humanity, and what do they tell us about human nature in general, about ourselves?
Hmm.
So it's in that sense that we can say that prehistory becomes a major issue. Suddenly, it's no longer Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome. It's suddenly the question of what happens for the great antiquity before that.
Hmm. What you've been describing is what we call deep time. This sort of the discovery of the notion, as you said, I think it was very prevalent in the well, about the time of perhaps of certainly by the 1600s, by the 17th century. The idea in theological circles, as you mentioned, is that the Earth, according to Bishop Ussher, was about 6,000 years old, and he calculated that even down to the day and the moment and the day of the week, which is just kind of silly on the face of it. But this was widely accepted, and you mentioned the Catholic Church, which of course sort of had an intellectual stranglehold on the whole exchange of ideas certainly in Western Europe. Anyway, so even the concept of deep time, the idea that human beings had been here not for a few thousand years, but for millions of years, how was that accepted by educated people by the church, by anybody, when, as you said, geologically, the evidence seemed, and this was before they could do the kind of carbon dating test that we've come to think about now. This was really revolutionary.
This was really revolutionary because, think of Usher as offering a solution. There are a lot of problems about dating, and Usher ends up in one end of the story. It sounds silly to us, but it was a great solution for a number of problems. And it helped the stranglehold, a certain religious stranglehold over scholarly ideas and
Mhm.
over suggesting that certain people may not really be, certain scholars may not be functioning in bad faith when they raise questions. So, parallel to this story, we have a couple of other stories that complicate let's say, a biblical account of of modern humanity. The first one is the discovery of indigenous peoples. The encounter with indigenous peoples produces a number of problems because these are not people to be found in the Bible, or if they are, where do you place them? And you get a lot of humanists and a lot of scientists trying very carefully to create dates. Would you place this people here at what point in Genesis? And then reconstruct it. And what does this mean about their humanity? So, as on the one hand, people raise questions about the earth, they also raise questions about a human state of nature, or how did human beings exist, uh, let's say in nature. And they actually have an answer, so to speak. They look at indigenous people, or they imagine them more often than they look at them, and they say, well, presumably we were once like they are, but we advanced and they stayed in this natural state. So we became, complex trading people. They stayed um, as quote unquote simple people, or people with who live in poverty. And so you get all sorts of hierarchies that have to be somehow established, debated, figured out. The church does one version of this on asserting the humanity of indigenous people, but also that they ought to be proselytized. Scholars begin to try and give accounts. Okay, so if we start looking at crania, if at skeletons and heads, what differences do we make between what they describe as a modern European and somebody living in the Andaman Islands? So at one level, they suddenly turn the existence of others into objects of study and research. And with the rise of racial science in the 19th century, this very often speaks about, okay, here's who we are versus them. But it produces also an immediate space. And that's something I find really fascinating, where when they find a Neanderthal cranium, they immediately go like, okay, well, we've already counted other um, other crania on the planet. Let's figure out how we're going to locate this one in relation to them. The Neanderthal is a particular problem for them because it's also very large. So they end up in all sorts of debates as to how can there be such a large skull? How can you have such a large brain cavity in the skull? Then in parallel, they start discovering others elsewhere. And so human history, let's say, the history of the human body becomes a real priority for them. And a question, are these racial differences? Are they species differences? They try to come up again and again with solutions. And so at times, this is the really cool science, and the newspapers will publish it as here's the new controversial, cool, but we don't really know what it means kind of science. And at other times, they'll um, present these as matters that are only for scientists because they're too troubling to bring out. Scientists, of course, love the attention, and so the entire circle around Lyell and Darwin is publishing endlessly to be able to answer some of these questions and to debate some of these questions in public. So by the 1840s, 1850s, I mean, of course, Darwin's 1859 for the origin of species, and 1871 he comes late into the game on human descent, as he calls it. Um, but already in the 1840s, 1850s, there are lots of debates about what kind of evidence these skeletons are, these skulls, and what do we make of tools that were found around them or of other objects that were found in excavations around them. So
Hmm.
it becomes a public question at the same time, just as the European colonial projects are taking off again
Hmm.
for control of other parts of the world.
Yeah, I was going to say. So, to be clear, when you started that and said indigenous people, what we're talking about is at the same time that we begin to see this, is we begin to see the English, the Spanish begin their colonization projects of what became North and South America, and it to this point, our discussion sounds like we're talking about scholars sitting in laboratories discussing things or over conference tables. It sounds very anodyne, but at the same time, to get to the heart of your book and the last part of your subtitle, our obsession with human origins, all of this becomes very important because it becomes an they versus us sort of thing. Those people are different, and we can now justify whatever we do because we're civilized and they're not. So I just dropped a big net on a small net on your big subject because you spend most of your book talking about this is why people were so interested in this and, to use your word, obsessed. So, if you can talk about that in some detail, how we became obsessed with human origins and how they began to be used ideologically and politically to justify things.
Right. So in the early stages of colonization, human history wasn't really needed, or human prehistory wasn't really needed as an explanation. But in the 19th century, every finding about human antiquity gets translated into findings about native peoples in some part of the world or some other part of the world. So each comes to justify the other. Studying prehistory is about being able to talk about other people on the planet. Now, there are multiple ways of describing other peoples. The usual ones were as savages or as barbarians. That there's a whole ranking there. But the other word that's the most fitting is the word primitive. The word primitive was to signal that somebody who lives, that somebody is really primal, is really among the first people on the planet. And so it's a very convenient scenario for um, conquering and occupying and dominating other people, to say, like, really, these people haven't advanced since the infancy of humanity. They really are like children, and we need to help them along. It's a great ideological setup. And so I think that colonization, or really the kind of expansion of European empires in the 19th century, on the one hand, and the study of prehistory, work to celebrate each other. And I think that this creates a public image that's, on the one hand, really very flattering. Look at us, the civilized. And at the same time, it creates this image that if that a scholar who's studying some skull somewhere is telling us great things about human beings, present and past. And in a way, this becomes scholarship that really sells. To this day, so when H.G. Wells published the Outline of History, he sold something like 1.5 million copies in just a few years. Outlandish numbers. And people really didn't get past the first 50, 80 pages, which were about prehistory. Those who did were already primed to do so, and they knew this material. Darwin's books went through many editions very, very quickly. More recently, I read somewhere that Yuval Harari's *Sapiens* sold over 15 million copies. Those are astounding numbers for, for a book, all the more so for a nonfiction book. And so, in a way, people tried to answer questions that they would have had answers for through religion in earlier periods, or through which they still had answers that they found unsatisfying through religion, by way of going to prehistory. For me, what's really important about this is that it creates a very strange and interesting loop in which people are doing good faith research. They are, studying to the best of their abilities and using the most contemporary science that they can. And somehow, in the process, this becomes very deeply politicized by the time that it hits the public eye. It's also very politicized because of who many of these people are. They are, as you said, even those who are sitting in their labs or are sitting in, in a comfortable couch, wherever the university is, even they have political commitments in their ideas and beliefs. So in a way, what happens is that despite all the best possible efforts, the fact that this is about who we are as human beings introduces all sorts of ideas into the research itself. And the more that we want to grapple with who are we as human beings, the more we end up answering on the basis of things that don't really have to do with, this hominid here or that social practice there. We end up having very elaborate answers that deal with, when did the patriarchy begin, or when did what was ancient matrilineality like? That's the descent of the family and of property through the mother rather than the father. This is one set of questions. Other sets of questions that emerge are, how old is the human psyche? What is it like? In what way is this human psyche really transformed now? Are we comfortable with the idea that a human psyche is eternal? Or do we want to see it as something that's really very modern? People are very anguished about all these possible solutions. And I think in some respects we still are. So we eat up these publications one after the other. In the New York Times, it's a little bit less so now, but for about a decade, you would get tons of accounts, let's say from about 2010 to 2020, of some dig somewhere that had resulted in a finding of this type and tells us all of these things about human beings in general. So that's the scenario that to me was really fascinating, that you start with relatively small things, but then everything puts us in question as human beings. It asks who we are and what it is that we want to be claiming or asking or pushing as a meaning of humanity in general. Sorry, that
Hmm.
was a very long answer,
No,
but
no, not at all. Not at all. Because there's so much to unpack there. Because essentially, what you're getting at here is that as they found remains, as they dug up pottery, whatever it was, about some long gone human being or civilization, you make the point that it was always linked. Oh, this explains who we are. This
yes,
explains why we act the way we do. This explains why we're violent by nature, or why we shouldn't be violent by nature, because
yes,
they were violent or they weren't violent, depending on who you talk to or who you listen to, or this skull or that skull. Um, it's fascinating that it becomes, as you say repeatedly in this book, it really becomes much more always about us and the battles that we're fighting. Because while this is going on in Western Europe, at the same time, we began to see the invention of what we would call now nation states, right? That the
exactly.
Germans particularly are creating a nation. The English are becoming British. It means something when you say I am Italian, and it's
Yes,
almost always linked to race, not
yes,
culture, but race. And particularly with a vengeance, the Germans really in the 18th century began doing this, and you take us all the way through the 20th century, and we know the tragic consequences of that. But if you will
right.
talk about that a bit, the connection between race and what you've been describing to this point, the science of discovering the past.
Right. So one of the really fascinating problems for 18th century intellectuals was what happened to Rome? Why did Rome collapse? Um, and the great answer in Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is that two things happened: the German barbarians and Christianity. Now, the German barbarians were a sort of obsession of learned Europeans for a long time already, because of texts already from Julius Caesar and Tacitus that said, there's these Germans, there's these peoples in, you know, east of the Rhine and to like way to the north of us. They're way too troubling. They're vulgar and aggressive, but they do have their own morality. They don't write anything. They're savages, but they have their own morality and they're really developed in their own ways. Now, in the early modern period, this idea that you had gone from these ancient Germans to then what was called the barbarian invasions, anyone from Ostrogoths and Visigoths and Vandals to Huns and so on, who had entered Europe. The idea gradually rose that these weren't simply, groups of people around some particular leader, as scholars have now shown they were. but that they were ethnically unified, that they were one race in a way. And the word race was pliable enough to do this kind of work. So suddenly the idea was that all these Germans were natives and to what is now Germany, that regardless of their differences as groups, they were noble savages. They were good and ethical, and they treated one another with respect, and they were democratic, and they developed laws of their own. And in assaulting the, gradually degenerating Roman Empire, they won because they were pure. That idea develops its own history. Now, one thing that's important to note is that these ancient Germans, again, they aren't a racial unity. They aren't a single group. We know relatively little about some of their paths through Europe, and we have nevertheless mapped them onto Europe as if we knew exactly what followed. But the other side that's important is that these ancient Germans were described not only as noble savages, but as somehow outside of history. Much as the world before Mesopotamia appeared outside of history, these people, because they don't have this, because we don't have historical documents that have survived from them, were also marked as outside of history. So the late 18th century, you get a lot of German thinkers who are celebrating this kind of new man, as they call it, as Herder calls them, peoples of the North who had no history and kind of rejuvenated humanity. As you move on into the 19th century, on the one hand, this becomes all about racial beliefs. It also, however, begins to translate in many other domains. One domain where it translates is into the study of languages. So what other Europeans are calling Indo-European languages and are trying to figure out what's the relationship between Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Celtic, German as languages. The Germans call them Indo-Germans. They don't call them Indo-Europeans, they call them Indo-Germans. And the Germans are very happy to suggest that just as Germany was the birthplace of these noble German, they don't call them barbarian invaders, they call them the migrating peoples. So too they think that Germany was probably where this ancient language, this foundational language for all the great languages of the ancient world developed. So you get a racial and a linguistic argument that then people can say, look, I'm not a racist. I just believe that the language began in Germany. And you get these ever strengthening beliefs that there is a kind of German continuity to this. Now, the Germans aren't the only ones who make this claim. Of course, the Greeks think that the ancient Greeks are the best. And, in France, you get things that happen on French territory appear more important. All our classification of the Paleolithic period is dependent on particular locations where findings were made in the later 19th century that then supposedly explain the Paleolithic developments. But the Germans were particularly intent on this, and this was partly because they didn't have a state of their own. Germany was divided into multiple small statelets, some of them bigger, like Prussia or Bavaria, but others being almost city-states. And so as the nation state, as Germany is unified in 1871, these priorities, these older questions come to give a great oomph, already from give strength, let's say, to this idea that Germany is a unit. Already in the 1820s and 1830s, you get something similar with the Grimm brothers and the fairy tales. So just as you get a kind of German culture, which then gets racialized, you get this idea in ancient Germans who are great just as we are supposedly great. This extends very interestingly even to the most absurd little moment. So when the first Neanderthal skull and a couple of bones are found in a quarry near Düsseldorf, the thing that struck me about reading scholars publishing about this is that they immediately say, it's clear that these are somehow linked to the ancient Germans. And you just sort of say, well, how? But the thought is that these are disappeared peoples, that these are disappeared ancient groups that had, different physical characteristics, just as native peoples are supposedly disappearing in the present. So the history of race is very much written into this double idea. Is human nature eternal? And are races, let's say, truly ancient creations that don't change? And you have arguments in these debates that say, yes, human nature is eternal, human races are basically distinct, or are they dependent on a particular history? And so there, particular peoples are very happy to celebrate themselves. And the Germans are perhaps the worst offenders in this regard.
Mm-hmm.
All the way to the post-war period, all the way to the 1960s and 1970s, you have moments where intellectuals, often in newfound states, often in new states, who begin to claim like, okay, we are special because of the peoples who were found here. The most famous case of this is the Chinese Sinanthropus. Um, the Sinanthropus pekinensis, originally called Peking man, uh, um, what do we call them? Fossils were found in the 1920s. Some of the originals were lost, but the copies survived and survive. And the People's Republic of China makes a very big case that perhaps we should be thinking about humanity as originating in East Asia. Other scholars, some, for example, from Senegal, are very committed to an argument that really humanity begins, not only humanity begins in Africa, but true culture begins in a sort of hidden spot somewhere in West Africa, and that Egyptian culture is a sort of derivative of that. So this isn't to doubt any given argument. It's just to say that people really love to find themselves in their ancients and then replay that commitment in the present time, often not recognizing what, or sometimes very actively recognizing what national and racial claims this enables them to make.
Mm-hmm. And you make it clear that it's one of the most, I mean, this is not your word, it's my word. It's one of the most insidious things to come out of all of this because it's all linked to the idea that this is supposed to be finding our racial origins will unify us,
Yes.
us against whoever this unnamed them is. We have just come out of a presidential election in which the whole idea of immigration and what to do about it, how to stop it, how to deal with it was a huge issue. And we heard words like our national blood. So as I read your book, you refer to this idea. It goes back as early as this whole conversation begins about the origins that because what you're talking about here is the idea that one civilization, I'm putting quotes around that, is
Yeah.
superior. There's a morally superior value being attached to one group of people as opposed to these other people because they are different. They're not civilized. Again, quotes around that. They don't have industry. They don't have technology. They don't have, I'm thinking, of the indigenous. They don't have a written language. And all these things that you used the word early on, we want to help them along. And I'm putting quotes around that because the help they wanted to give was usually to absolutely exterminate them.
Yeah.
And you
Or that was the effect. Or that
that
was
was
the
the
effect.
effect. Yeah. And so there's a lot going on there too, but it talk about how this has this idea because it bleeds right into the whole thing about the hordes, right?
Yes.
These people, they're washing over us, what they're going to do to us, to our culture, to our way of life. It is directly attached to the idea and the obsession with human origins, isn't it?
Yes. It's absolutely attached to human origin. So first off, there are long discussions about large migrations all through this period. Of course, the sort of the quote unquote barbarian invasions is an example. The whole question of leaving of a departure from Africa is an example. But by the 1860s, 1870s, you begin to have all these theories that somehow, just as Europe was once overrun, just as the Mongols at some point or other, just as the Mongols at some mythical point in time at this point overran Europe. I'm not saying that they didn't. I'm saying that the the idea creates this fortress Europe idea that past invasions, which were invasions is a particular term, a particular modern military term. Just as migrations were invasions, so too this will happen again. And so you begin to have very aggressive arguments against immigration from China, including in the US. But you begin to have these fantasies played out in novel after novel that somehow untold huge hordes from Africa or Asia are going to invade again. And that these are primitives, literally primitives, who just are in such large numbers that they're going to flood and overcome. Now, this language of the flood and the language of hordes is a language that has survived and that continues to this day. It produced a lot of, long fantasies at the end of the day, or, uh, let's say people would describe a nightmare situation, but they're basically fantasizing themselves suffering in some imaginary future because of the primitives who would come from elsewhere. The very same people that Europe was ruling over, by the way. Let's just not skip this side. It's not like this is the revolt of native people. It's like you're claiming that they will revolt and overtake us the moment that you've actually conquered them. So that scenario played itself out, and it survived in the post-war period, both with various arguments about, okay, so how do you establish Europe now? And how do you set up something like a fortress Europe so that this will not happen again? This plays a small role in the setup of the EU. But it plays a great role in the survival of fascist ideas in the 60s and 70s. So the idea becomes essential that non-Europeans are going to flood and overtake Europe. It's even a kind of strange metaphor, right? Like, how does a horde flood? But the point is, you have a kind of primitive horde that is attacking, and then it's naturalized. It's almost like a natural force is overtaking. Now, that language continued. It survived it happened the moment that Syrians left during the Civil War to reach Europe. The European far right was incredibly aggressive in using the language of foreign flooding invaders and so on. And that's also the first moment when really Donald Trump began speaking of Mexico isn't sending us their best people, they're sending us their rapists. All of this is a sexualized language. All of this is a racial language. A lot of the time, it's a kind of language where you can say it almost sounds like a language of fear. And it's just a kind of generic language of fear. But there are very elaborate underpinnings for it. In Europe, to use that example, the president of Hungary insisted that there was a slow trickle becoming a flood of non-Europeans taking over and threatening the great, whatever of Europe. He used the language of flood all the time, which is kind of funny because Hungary is a landlocked country. There's no, it doesn't really immediately translate in some way.
Mm-hmm.
But this continues to play out, and it's the kind of thing where people say, I'm not here to say anything, but don't you think it's a little concerning that there are these numbers of people crossing a border, this or that? It becomes a step-by-step scenario where we deny people their humanity and we present ourselves as caring for them. And as, we're here to care for others, but we can't quite care for all these people who are attacking us. So it's a little bit like the people in the wealthier countries of the world describing people in poorer countries of the world as somehow attacking us because at the end of the day, they don't have what we have. And a lot of the questions then follow, but are not asked, well, why don't they have it? Well, because this is how modernity has developed. This is where money has been. This is how, this is where conquest brought profits as opposed to countries that don't have that option. So that
Mm-hmm.
I think is one of, as you said, insidious parts. And it's insidious also because it can coexist with other ideas. I think of ideas as existing together. We have many contradictory ideas in our minds at the same time, and we don't really think about them. We don't like to be pushed on them. Sometimes we try to be very clear about it. But that side is really very important in this, that it's not simply a matter of people on the far right. Many of these ideas have exist, continue to exist, kind of left unchecked or left unthought. The idea of the flooding hordes is one. The idea of the natives who just vaguely disappear is
Hmm.
this language of the disappearing native was everywhere when I was looking for it. And the explanation would often be like, well, ancient peoples disappeared. So are these natives disappearing? But they're not disappearing. Either we're killing them in battle or we're passing to them microorganisms, bacteria, and so on that they don't have an immune system for.
Hmm.
Not to mention, you know, displacing them from the way that they have lived very easily creates social shocks that then put them in a kind of vicious cycle to their demise. These languages, I would have never thought anything of the disappearing native a while back.
Hmm.
And I think that many people simply didn't think that these were potentially troubling ideas. At the end of the day, if somebody tells you your house is going to be attacked, you just sort of think about that first, and then
Hmm.
what language did they use?
Yeah.
The Nazis used this language very elaborately. They used the language of Judeo-Bolshevik invasion from the East constantly. They use the language of we Germans are like the ancient Germans. We are the ones who will renew the world. They use that language all the time. Uh, they suggested that they were like the ancient Greeks, that they were fundamentally Aryan, but you need to be capable of having consciousness of that Arianism in order to exist and renew the world. So they use multiple languages in order to, make these ideas palatable. And I think what I was very concerned about this book is that yes, even today, people use these languages that we would like to sent back to the 20th century, to let's say to the violent 20th century. But we use these languages in ways that are deeply political and deeply racial, but where we can also disavow that they mean anything significant. Oh, we're just looking at what these skulls are. Oh, we're just thinking about the migrations of people. Oh, there we are. We're talking about being attacked in massive numbers by, deeply impoverished people whose interest is in getting a job at the end of the day and being able to raise a family. So
Hmm.
that part of my, let's say, more political side of the book is about these kinds of questions.
Uh, and you take us through sort of chronologically from beginning with Rousseau in the mid 18th century, and people debating about who these people were that came before us. What do they say about human nature? What do they tell us about our origins? What do they have to say to us? And then we get to the 20th century, and the most, as you just said, the most violent century with World War One, and then World War Two, the Nazis, the Japanese, these empires, unimaginable violence, unimaginable atrocities. And so suddenly we have to come to grips with if we're so civilized, if we are so superior, not only to these indigenous people, but to these people who came so long ago, we have to figure out is war part of who we are?
Yeah,
Does it link us back to our earliest origins, or were those people quite civilized or quite peaceful? Not to use the word
yeah.
civilized, quite peaceful. The 20th century had an enormous impact on man to understand his origins.
And so there are two or three stories that I tried to tell in the book about the violence. I mean, the Nazi chapter is a real peak for me because it's as if everything that I've been describing
Hmm.
up to this point, sometimes is more insidious, sometimes is blander forms. Like the Nazis use all of those ways of speaking about the deep,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
um, and they deploy them systematically for the extermination of the Jews of Europe.
Hmm.
Then, there are two other things that one more thing I want to point out before going to this debate about aggression and peacefulness. One has to do with bombing. Um, the chapter there's a famous expression by Curtis LeMay when he was running to be vice president, where he says, if the Vietnamese don't do as we say, we'll just bomb them back to the Stone Age. And so I thought, and then I remember that being used um, during the war with the Taliban in the early 2000s. So I said, well, maybe I should start looking, where do these expressions come in? Now, the interesting backstory is that while bombing civilian populations was considered illegal in international law in the already before 1900, let's leave aside whether that was actually ever listened to, but it was considered illegal to bomb another city. It was not considered a problem if you wish to bomb the populations that were not states, meaning the people you've colonized. So the British basically shelled and bombed all their way through the 19th century and into the 20th. And then we can begin to ask questions about what happens. People begin to be outraged about the bombing um, of particular sites, really with Guernica and with Abyssinia in the 1930s. Once you can say, well, it's actually the fascists who are doing it. But the British and the French were doing it almost at the same moment. And then we get World War II. And this concerns the firebombing of German cities, the firebombing of virtually every major Japanese city, nuclear bombs, the destruction by the British and the US of much of Germany at the time. And of course, that the Germans did exactly the same thing. I'm not describing it as the evil is on one side or something, but it is a horror, and it continues afterward into Korea, into the Korean War, and we know about napalm and so on from there on. Now, a lot of that is this shift of a language from like, well, you can bomb those who are back in the Stone Age, to an idea that we don't really bomb to kill people, we bomb to destroy infrastructure. And if this leaves people back in the Stone Age, so be it. So that's a kind of expression that sounds like a joke almost, but nonetheless becomes really forceful. Now, in the post-war period after 1945, the question of, okay, so if everybody's doing the killing, where does this all come from? Becomes a really key question. On the one hand, because UNESCO and other organizations are trying really very actively to get rid of racism. And so on the one hand, they tried to get rid of this and to say like, okay, so how can we possibly live peacefully from here on? Particularly given that the US and the Soviet Union have already entered the Cold War by the time that the UNESCO documents are written. But scholars begin to, let's say, be drawn not to people, not to skulls and skeletons that appear, peaceful, to appear to have been peaceful, but to sites where they think that violence had occurred at the very beginnings of humanity. Now, the person who is most responsible, there are two people who are most responsible for this image. The one, Raymond Dart, is the discoverer of Australopithecus africanus in South Africa. The skull is given to him, and very quickly he develops a sort of story of himself as a victim of other scientists whose truth has been pushed underground. Now, in some respects, people didn't take him seriously enough, that's true, and they should have paid a different kind of attention to what happened. But part of the reason was that he was making major, major claims on the basis of one partly deformed skull that they didn't really all want to hang their hats on that one discovery. And as Dart became more resentful of this, he also developed all these stories about ancient hominids, Australopithecines especially, having been killer apes. When Robert Ardrey, a not particularly successful Hollywood screenwriter, met Dart, he began to write nonfiction books. The Princeton historian Erica Milam, in her book Creatures of Cain, writes how Ardrey basically rode the wave of the scientific paperback, of the very cheap, you know, sometimes $50 paperback, to great fame and fortune. He presented the human origins out of Africa story, but which, yes, right, correct. But he also presented it as a story of violence, in which ancient humans were constantly battling each other. They would, break each other's skull to scoop out their brain because that was the most, nutrient-rich part of the body. They were cannibals. They were this, they were that. And so Dart, Dart's theory and Dart's, belief that he had been slighted became an artery, this idea that to understand why humanity is violent, why the Ouroboros eats its tail, why humanity is capable of a Holocaust or of a nuclear bomb, you have to go back to this idea that we have been violent since our very beginnings. And on occasions when we're not violent, that's another story. Like it just so happened. But we need to make sure that we recognize that deep sense of aggressiveness. Others were doing the same. The German scientist Konrad Lorenz similarly studied aggression. Aggression became a sort of holy grail of early neuroscience because it was the question of, okay, how do we understand how we stabilize society? How do we stop people from being violent, whether violent in the home or more generally? Aggression became the real key. And it also became a kind of obsession as well. It was the idea now that really it's native people who are violent because we can see them and we know about Australopithecines. So if we see a scene of violence, it's they who are being violent, not us taking over their land, for example. And so a debate arose really in the late 1960s and 1970s, particularly as some scholars turned around to say, this is just silly. There's relatively little knowledge as to what aggression amounts to. Were people aggressive with people within their group or with people who were perhaps attacking them? Are those the leftovers, let's say, that we have? Are those the fossils that we get to see of aggression? Some people wanted to say, well, even if they were aggressive, we've overcome this. And other anthropologists became increasingly they became increasingly intent on showing that, in fact, most people who live in small communities really just want to figure out how they're going to survive. And then they have no real reason to have chiefs, states, and so on. Violence will end up occurring when they and others, or they and states, get to fight one another. And so this idea of whether we are peaceful, good tool makers who really just wanted, to make some tools, catch the necessary animals, gather what was necessary, otherwise live relatively happy lives in a small space. Whether we are that or we are the product of all this aggression has continued. And in some ways continues now. There are particular passages that are used, so you can see versions of it. For example, Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, insists that the world is getting better every day. Enlightenment is upon us. We shall no longer do anything horrible to anybody else. Yuval Harari says that the fundamental fear that people lived in earlier in human history is overcome. Who was it? Jared Diamond insisted that native peoples were of a kind of particularly ferocious violence, especially in Papua New Guinea, where he had seen. And others insisted that this is just, you can reinterpret the same material to suggest that, in fact, these are moments of particular shock when you see forms of violence. And in fact, our world isn't fundamentally less violent. It's just differently structured. And so that part for me became the real, let's say, the powering part of what powered my concerns in the later 20th century. Because the science has gotten better. But as always, the science will get better, but that doesn't mean anything because we describe the science through the language we already have and through our commitments and our ways of relating to one another. And we can turn perfectly good science into politically really troubling science and then claim that we know the truth, right? Because it's science. Or we can do the inverse and we can be very cautious, which is what I really wanted out of this book, to say one needs to get rid of some of this drama and think dispassionately about these questions of early humanity. Not to say that we are them who lived back then, but to think a little bit of what does it mean for us to be human beings today? And what happens with all of these problems around aggression and so on today.
Yeah. You have summarized it all very nicely there, because I was going to say that the whole idea of violence is if we can prove that our earliest ancestors were violent by nature, it excuses
Exactly.
what we are doing. It excuses mass bombings. It excuses even nuclear holocaust. What would anyone expect? It's in our nature, and I'm putting quotes around that. And you push back against all of that. I want to sort of get to real quickly to sort of like the big ultimate picture of the so what here, and what do we do going forward. The reviewer in the New Republic said that what you've got here at the end is an impassionate call for radical modesty, which I wrote that down because it really jumped out at me. You just alluded to it there that you do say we need to stop looking to the past or the deep past for to try to understand who we are. We live in the world that we created. But at the same time, and I mentioned this to you a little bit in our email correspondence, you and I and all of us study history in part to understand our society and who we are. I don't think you're calling for us to stop studying the past, right?
Correct. Correct. I don't think we stop studying the past. I think the problem is elsewhere. I think the problem is in this question, who are we? And
Mm-hmm.
demand that we provide it with an answer. I think it's a great question. I think we need to know that we're not going to give it a great answer. Let me give you an example. We can say that, of course, most of our DNA, most of our bodies is the same as that which, that of human beings tens and even hundreds of thousands of years ago. Great. Okay, but are we really this DNA? We live in a society where, our lemons come from Argentina, our beef can come from Japan. I'm not implying that mine does, but like, it can. We
Mm-hmm.
live in
Mm-hmm.
a society in which we can insert, bionic parts into our bodies from our kneecaps that when we need a surgical replacement to whatever else we think with. We communicate with one another using devices that didn't exist 15 years ago and at levels and speeds that, obliterate distance in a way that never was imaginable. Wasn't imaginable a century ago and probably wasn't imaginable at the current rate even a little while ago. I would argue that that is much more important for what our society is, and that in a way we need to be able to study historically who we are, not to find some sort of escapist approach. I don't think that that is a good solution to this. It's the more we say yes, we are the same as the apes that came down from the trees and were making love in the savannah and were making tools and so on and so forth, the more we forget that we have fundamentally changed. Now, how we think about this change is sometimes a different business, but it ought to alert us to the sense that racial solutions are somehow completely absurdly outdated, not only because they're wrong, but also because it's like they pull us back into a way of conceiving the world that's got no relation to our most basic daily rituals, our most elaborate our complex commercial networks, our relationships to our jobs, our relationships to each other. And so to me, the sense was that's what I think the reviewer means as radical modesty, that it's probably best that we stop thinking of ourselves as either we were evil and now we are good, or either we were aggressive and now we're kind, or to stop creating these giant continuities in which we human beings are the center of the universe. We're not. There's a great passage from Carl Sagan that we live in the boondocks. We have existed for a tiny fraction of the existence of the universe, and we are, for all we know, there's nobody else who can be charged with a survival of meaning in the universe, except for ourselves. So, in a way, the kinds of care and engagement and plurality and the possibility of relating to other people really truly need to be thought anew. And this is an attempt to provide a very little contribution to this of something that, yes, it's not like it will go away. I don't think that we want to not study ancient humanity. And I don't think but we should be studying not because we'll get something out of it. We're not going to get something fundamentally superior about ourselves out of it. We will just get tentative answers that every few years are going to look outdated, and we'll continue obsessing about a human essence when in fact it's this, human creation that is modernity, one that feels overwhelming to us, or at least to each of us, but nevertheless is a world that exists now, not the, whatever happened to one Australopithecine here, a nation there, and so on and so forth. And in the
Mm-hmm.
past.
Mm-hmm. Uh, One of the most startling things, I mean, again, it's not that I didn't already know this, but I think people in general, we all think that we're progressing, right? Things are going to be better, quote
Yeah.
unquote, whatever that is. The future is going to be better than the present. The present is better than the past, although people are also horrifically nostalgic. In fact, your book was
Yeah.
reviewed with some books on
Yeah.
nostalgia. The idea that we always want to go back, right? I mean, let's face it. One of the major political campaigns that we just witnessed is all about somehow going back.
And
That's sort of
yeah.
what you're getting at here. The idea that, first of all, we need to accept that the idea of progress is also an illusion, right?
Yeah.
That things may not be better. Things can get worse. Horrific diseases may come back. We will continue to do horrible things to each other, and the disillusionment those things cause is, in some cases, our own creation, because we've
Yes.
created this fantasy, right?
That's right. So I think both the progress and the nostalgia are problematic solutions, let's say. Progress is a problem because we see a new car and we think of it as representing progress. We get a new computer because the old one wasn't working very fast and the new one is getting better. Sure, but is that really in some way social progress or is it a technological progress? Is technological progress in any way is it necessarily good for us? I think that any parent would tell you, as I would, that I really don't want my kids spending even more time depersonalized on social media or being able to potentially, I mean, we all hope that it's not around us, but it happens, being able to write something nasty to somebody further away because there's no direct connection through the device. So the question of progress is a really tricky one where an old word really one that was developed in the later 19th century and was already critiqued in the 1930s. People would speak of the crisis of progress, left and right. An old word remains with us because it gives us a sense of our meaning. Nostalgia at the same time is similarly a problem because it gives us the sense that we can somehow recapture or relate to a time that we have, blown out of proportion for its supposed grandeur. I think that this is characteristic, I would say, of both political parties. Both political parties have the moments that they would like to return to, and both of them have a fantasy of progress as to how this will go. So, you know, the Democrats will routinely refer back to FDR or Johnson or, even moments in Clinton and the hope of the early Obama moment. And they will describe this as a mode of progress, of being a progressive at this. That means rather different things, but it feels as though they belong together. That sense of using our history to create precious moments that power us as we seek to affect our politics. I mean, that happens, but it is a tricky space, and it's one that in this election clearly didn't convince enough people. And as for the idea that somehow there will be some version of national progress on the basis of, effectively a series of cruel programs and ways of dismantling the American state, I don't quite see how that's going to be um, any sort of great solution for a return to some American grandeur. On the contrary, let's say both sides fill me with worry, and what we see around us right now definitely fills me with worry.
We are in your debt because, as a historian of ideas, it's what we want is to get people to sort of pause for a moment and reflect about where we are and how we got here, and the things we carry with us every day that create the world around us. And your book does that. There's so much here we didn't even begin to get a chance to talk about. I would recommend that anyone who wants to understand the human condition that needs to grapple with the ideas in your book, and take your time while you do it. The book is entitled The Invention of Prehistory, Empire, Violence, and Our Obsession with Human Origins. It is published by Liveright. It came out in 2024. Stefanos, thank you so much for taking time out of a busy day and career to be with us and talk about these big, important issues.
Dan, thank you so much. This was, first off, you're an amazing interviewer, and at the same time, I really want to thank you for all this kind attention and the way of presenting the book. I'm most grateful to you.
Thank you. My thanks to Stefanos Geroulanos for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at www.norton.com and at his website, Stefanos-Geroulanos.com. That's Stefanos-Geroulanos.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, the czar of our Tallahassee office, as well as the captain of the Off the Beaten Path Rabbit show jumping team, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Krellin. All guest accommodations on Off the Beaten Path provided by the Horseshoe Road Inn. Our Off the Beaten Path fact checker is Ella Fino. The director of accounts payable is Bill Schroeder. Our director of employee loyalty is Upton Leftis. Our staff layoff specialist is Harry Verderci, assisted by layoff counselor Oscar LaVista. The Off the Beaten Path complaint calls specialist is Levon Hold. Our audience data collector is Paul Murky of Murky Research, assisted by statistician Mar Genovera. The staff physicist is Momentum. Our Russian chauffeur is Pickup and Drop-Off. Our financial advisors are provided by the firm of Ilgott & Gaines. Our staff bus driver is Borden Drowsy. Our in-house literary critic is Al Lagori. The holiday wardrobe consultant is Don Wienow. Our staff director of Three Stooges Studies is Lee Iappoca. Dr. Todd Gross's personal eBay specialist is Selma Junkoff, and our Off the Beaten Path martini mixer, thank you very much, is Olive Twist. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including now on YouTube and YouTube Music. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app. That would be most helpful and appreciated. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Please also visit the official Off the Beaten Path website at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out my videos, my blog, and similar radically modest podcasts like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.